So, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today is third event for Indie Author Day. So, let's talk about historical fiction. My name is Sonal Gosai and I work at the Pohik Regional Library as an information adult librarian. During this presentation, please make sure to turn off your videos and stay muted unless you are the speaker. We will have question and answer session at the end of our author presentation. So please enter any questions or comments into the chat. This program will be recorded and available on the library's website. So you may be wondering, what are indie authors? And why do we celebrate Indie Author Day? Indie author is someone who self-publishes to sell and who wants to reach as many readers as possible and grow a profitable author publishing business. So our annual Indie Author Day is a very special event for libraries and its readers because it allows us to meet and celebrate achievements of our local and indie writers. Today, we have a wonderful panel of writers to share their experiences as historical fiction writers. I would like to introduce E.A. Dustin, Stephen Lernett, Paul Martin, Tony Mayo, and Mike McCary. Welcome, and thank you all for being here. Let us start with our first question. So my first question is, tell us about yourself. E.A. Dustin, would you please like to go first?
Sure. Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm glad you're here. My name is Elfriede Dustin, but my pen name is E.A. Dustin. I've lived in this area for over 30 years. I'm a software assurance engineer at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab. I work in the space exploration sector. And, but given the current times, especially with all that copious spare time, I also do writing. I've written numerous technical books published by Addison Wesley and Prentice Hall for educational purposes over the last decades. But now I'm focusing on fictional writing, on fiction. So I've written a novel about World War II based on true events. And I just currently finished another book I'll be talking about pretty soon here.
Okay, thank you. Now, Stephen, would you like to go next? Tell us about yourself.
Yes, thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Steve Learned. This is my first publication. I'm a retired federal prosecutor. I spent 33 years prosecuting white-collar crime, either with the Department of Justice, doing cases around the country, or for 20 plus years here in Virginia as an assistant U.S. attorney. And so what happened was, once I retired, I decided to volunteer for the Park Service, and I requested the opportunity to volunteer at the Vietnam Memorial wall on the mall in Washington, which has the names of all 58,000 men and women who were killed in Vietnam. And I chose that.
Okay, Stephen.
Yes.
Okay,
sorry, was there a question?
Go ahead.
So,
you were breaking up for a little bit, but you're okay now. Go ahead.
Okay, good. So I did not serve, but anyway, I wanted to volunteer there because I watched the same TV shows, I drove the same cars, I listened to the same music as those men and women on the wall. So I did that, and I read a lot of memoirs, and I became very, very familiar with the circumstances of the war. And based on all those stories and information that I gathered over a number of years, I decided to tell my own story not about myself, but about two people. It's basically, well, we'll get into what the book's about, but that's my background.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Would you like to go next, Paul, and tell us about yourself?
Okay, my name's Paul Martin, and I'm a retired journalist. I spent 40 years as a journalist. I worked on a medical journal for 5 years and a boating magazine for a couple of years. And the last 30 years of my career, I was an editor at National Geographic. And the last 20, I worked on Traveler magazine. So I had the opportunity to travel quite a bit, write stories around the world, India, Vietnam, Egypt, domestic stories. And I retired from the National Geographic in 2009. And I had always had a lifelong interest in history and biography. And so when I retired, I needed some projects to work on. And I have so far written 3 nonfiction books that are collections of biographies of little known but amazing Americans. And I've also written 3 novels. 2 of them I published independently myself, and my most recent one was published by Level Best Books. So I've done some nonfiction and some fiction books.
Great, thank you, Paul. Tony Mayo, would you like to go next and tell us about yourself?
Sure. I've lived in Reston since 1986. I'm a business person. I took a fairly traditional route, going to college and a top business school, then getting involved with big companies, and it was horrifying. So I adjusted my life to be dedicated to promoting workplaces of humanity and prosperity. So I've worked as an executive coach for about 20 years now with the owner operators of businesses, because I found that publicly held companies are too driven by short-term financial decisions, especially since the 1980s. Whereas owner-operated companies have a bit more room for compassion and humanity without losing out on prosperity. So that's my mission in my work, and it's what my books are about as well.
Wow, thank you so much, Tony. Mike, would you like to go next and tell us about yourself?
Sure. My name is Mike McCary. I'm a retired trial attorney slash federal prosecutor. I've written 2 books. My first book is, I think, fits into the category of historical fiction. It's called An American Atrocity, and it's based on a series of atrocity cases that I prosecuted when I was serving in Vietnam with the 1st Marine Division.
Wow, thank you so much. Now, everybody had a chance to answer the first question. So now we are going to move to the next question. The second question is, tell us about your books. Sorry, tell us about your books. Why did you decide to write historical fiction? So I am going to ask E.A. Dustin to go first.
Sure. So my book, Save Me Twice, about World War II. Winston Churchill said, "History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it." And this is a statement because most World War II books have been written from the side of the winner. So I wanted to tell a World War II story that you don't necessarily find in history books. It's based on true World War II events. And growing up in Germany in the 70s, I heard a lot about World War II. So imagine, Save Me Twice. Let me give you a little bit of a background. So imagine October 1944, Germany and the Allied forces have landed already in Normandy. D-Day has already taken place, and the Russians are coming from the east. All Wehrmacht soldiers, all German soldiers have pretty much disappeared, and Hitler in his craziness pulls in young and old. He orders anyone over 12 or anyone over, under 60 into the war. So Save Me Twice talks about 16-year-old Karl that gets conscripted into the war as an SS. So the novel describes his trials and tribulations.
Wow, great. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you. Stephen, would you please tell us about your books and why did you decide to write historical fiction?
Well, I've always loved history, and the older I got, the more passionate I became about it. And you know, I experienced the '60s as a young man, and as I grew older, I realized what a breakout decade it was for our country. And but I was a little too immature at the time to fully appreciate it and understand it. So I decided to write about it. So the opportunity came to create my own story out of the information that I'd accumulated by reading. I probably read about 20 memoirs of war. I read plenty of histories, and I heard a lot of people talk. And my story is really about a young man who, from West Virginia, who, and I picked West Virginia because that state suffered the greatest per capita loss in the war. He was in law school. He was politically ambitious, and he decided to interrupt law school to join the Marine Corps because he knew that he had no political future in West Virginia if he dodged the Vietnam War. So he does it, and he just before he goes into training and to become an officer down in Quantico, Virginia, he meets a young lady up in Pittsburgh who is a protester. She's developed mostly along the lines of religious lines, pacifism, and they become very much connected to each other. He pursues her, and they have very opposing views. And the first 40% of the book really is romance in the sense of the magic that is created when they meet. They meet their families. She promises to wait for him. Finally, he goes to Vietnam. He experiences some war. There is some combat that I described, not too much. In the meantime, his story is juxtaposed to her story. She forms a chapter of the Catholic Peace Fellowship at the University of Wisconsin, and I talk about these particular protest events that would actually occurred at the University of Wisconsin. So she becomes an active protester. However, they're very committed to each other, and the whole book really is: are they going to survive this conflict? And he comes home and he tries to plot a political career, and he has to make a choice about pursuing her or pursuing politics. He chooses pursuing her, and I don't want to give away my ending, but it really is a love story embedded in the conflict of the war, the protest movement on the home front, and some of the warfare that was going on in Vietnam. So that's what it's about.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you so much. Paul, would you like to go next?
Certainly.
Tell us about your books and why did you decide to write historical fiction?
Well, as I said, working at National Geographic, I had a great interest in history and biography. And when I retired, I wrote the 3 books. My first one was called Secret Heroes, and this was about unsung American heroes. That was published by HarperCollins. I had 2 other collections of biographies, and one of my real loves as a reader is I love historical mysteries. And my book, which was released yesterday, is called Killin Floor Blues, and it's set in the Great Depression, and it's about a murder mystery about a serial killer who is killing the early blues greats, Charlie Patton, Robert Johnson, Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith. And the heroes in the book are, a lot of this is based on actual history. John and Alan Lomax were 2 pioneering musicologists, and so I set them up as the detectives in my book, and they're trying to track down the person who's killing the blues greats and trying to find out why in the world they're doing this. And the idea came to me one morning as I was riding my stationary bike, and I happened to think of the book Someone is Killing the Great Chefs of Europe. It was also a movie, and it was kind of a funny book, But I love the title. And my first working title for Killin' Floor Blues was Somebody's Killing the Great Blues Musicians. I dropped that though.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Tony, tell us about your books and why historical fiction.
Well, like Mike, my book is based on events in which I participated. And because I don't want to spend my life responding to lawsuits, I thought a novel was a better approach than writing it as nonfiction. uh, it's based on, originally I was just writing up a story for my clients on a sale I made, where illustrates some illustrations of selling. But as I put in more and more background information, I realized that the 1980s at MCI, where I was working, is where the American and pretty much world corporations went wrong. The CFO of MCI at that time left to start the first private equity company. They were financed with junk bonds. They had the attitude that workers were expendable, that you wore them out, tossed them aside, and hired new ones. That was explicitly said by the founder, Bill McGowan. So I realized that if I expanded this and made it into a compelling and humorous story, that people might pay attention to some of these very important political and economic issues. And I tried to make it as convincing as possible, not just by making it emotional and having characters you can care about, but including over 100 footnotes in this novel. So in case you wonder, some of these more outrageous things really happened, yeah, they happened.
Oh, great, great. That's awesome. Thank you so much, Tony. Mike, would you like to tell us about your books and why historical fiction?
Sure. In 1968, I was in Vietnam serving as the chief prosecutor for the 1st Marine Division when a major atrocity case came into our office. The case involved Marines killing unarmed Vietnamese civilians, in some cases in rather brutal ways. The facts of the case were not in dispute. A Marine squad of 10 men were out collecting intelligence about infiltration into the Da Nang area prior to Tet 1968. The squad was detected by a large enemy force and immediately attacked. The squad leader and the radio operator were killed very quickly. The enemy was about to overrun the Marine position when a young corporal ran through heavy enemy fire to get to the radio to call in an artillery strike on their position. When the artillery rounds began to fall, the enemy withdrew and 6 Marines survived. The next day, this hero went rogue and began killing every Vietnamese he could find. He signed a confession admitting what he had done, but in order to get a confession into evidence, the prosecution must first show that a crime was committed, and the only men who were able to testify that a crime was committed owed their lives to the bravery of this young corporal. The case generated some national publicity. There was an article, major article in Parade magazine that attacked the Marine Corps for bringing these cases and attacked me personally for being the prosecutor. To me, the case involved, presented a fascinating story that I felt that I just had to tell, that people had to learn about this. I wrote it as a novel. I could have written it as nonfiction, but I wrote it as a novel because the characters in my book are a lot more articulate than their actual counterparts in real life. Atrocity's storyline revolves around the question, are any of the potential witnesses to this crime, to these murders, going to rat out the guy who saved their lives? Which is an interesting philosophical question. At a deeper level, Atrocity is a story of young men making life and death decisions in a Vietnam War where the line between what's right and what's wrong was often blurred and not very clear. The actions um, of the characters in the book, um, the decisions that the characters in the book made, in some cases were heroic and good, and in some cases were tragic and very bad. The actions raise a question asked by one of the characters in the book, which is when you scrape away that thin veneer we call civilized values and you get down to raw humanity, what do you have? Atrocity is available on Amazon in softcover for $13.99. And it's actually available in Kindle for free. I'm not sure why Amazon decided to do that, but they did. It was also available in the Fairfax County Library a couple of years ago. I'm not sure it's still available.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Mike. Now we are going to move to our next question. And our next question is, where do you get your ideas? And would E.A. Dustin, would you like to go first?
Sure. So Save Me Twice, as I already mentioned, is a World War II story based on true events. And growing up in Germany, you can imagine that I would be very interested in World War II. And I asked my parents about the war, but there was always this secrecy around it. And as I got older in my late teens, I started to question my dad, who is actually Carl, the protagonist in the novel, who was conscripted into the war at 16. So he didn't want to talk about it until, we were older. And when he finally opened up, I said, Dad, you need to write this down. You need to write everything down that happened. And then he wrote it down. And so I turned his writing into a novel based on true events. And I also did a lot of additional research about World War II. So most of my ideas, even my ideas for my next book, Artemis Travels, is not historical fiction, it's technical fiction, but it's also based on true events, which is due out before the end of the year. So to answer your question, so far, most my ideas come from, true events or based on true stories.
Wow, that's awesome. Thank you so much. Thank
Sure.
you. Stephen, where do you get your ideas?
Well, from life itself, I guess. I mean, there's certain things that have always fascinated me, and one is how romance works. I mean, how is it that two people very different are attracted to each other? And I've always been keenly aware, and I've often asked people, what's it like when they first met their wife or something. It's always been very interesting to me is, well, what is it that brings two people together? So it's just observations, but then the really important factor was reading all these memoirs of Vietnam and in particular talking to veterans or family members at the Vietnam Memorial Wall in Washington when they come. The stories I heard were just amazing. I mean, you wouldn't believe some of these stories if you weren't talking to the person who actually witnessed that particular event. I took some of these stories and plugged them into my work, and they had a tremendous impact on me. So it really was things I read about Vietnam, things that I've always been curious about in life and have stored up in my memory. And those were the ideas I used.
Wow. Thank you, Steve. Thank you. Paul, where do you get your ideas?
Well, various places, and it's pretty clear we're all the same age group because my first novel was called Lost in Saigon, and it was based on my experiences as a Navy journalist in Saigon in 1970-71. And this is a cultural story. It's not a war story. It's a love story between a young American, semi-autobiographical, and a young Vietnamese woman. that wasn't true about me. I observed this. A lot of Americans, servicemen, civilian contractors cohabited with Vietnamese women. And when they left, there were a lot of biracial children left behind. And that's the sad climax of my story. This fellow falls in love with a Vietnamese woman. They live together for a year. He goes home and then she has his child. My second novel was called Far Haven. This was based directly on two of my favorite books, A Distant Mirror by Barbara Tuchman, which tells about the calamitous history of the 14th century, which included the Black Plague era. And the other book was A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking. I combined those two interests into a story that starts in a dystopian future. And my hero is a humanitarian, which the leaders of that era frown upon. There's a dictatorial leader, and the way they punished their enemies in that era is to send them to the worst periods in history. And my protagonist is sent back to 1349 London in the middle of the Black Plague. My idea for my latest book, Killin' Blues, ride a stationary bike. How this came together was I've been a lifelong fan of the blues. I've been a lifelong fan of history and biography. And I thought it would be wonderful to write a book, a novel set in the Great Depression, which my parents lived through. And I know a lot of firsthand stories. And it gave me a chance to research several of the blues greats and also the Great Depression. So as someone who loves history and biography, I combined all of those things into this work of fiction.
Wow, that is great. That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that, Paul. Thank you. Tony, would you like to share with us where do you get your ideas?
Well, I had my prepared answer, and then Steve said it. It's from life, living a life and paying attention. But I'll extend the question to why am I an author? Because we're all living life and more or less paying attention. And I think it's because I've always tried to make sense of things, try to organize it, try to make it seem like one thing causes another and then it moves forward. Now, as I get older, I more and more have doubts about whether there is that kind of cause and effect and so on. But there's a strong, strong human pull to put things into a story where A causes B so that it means something else. And as I continually do that in my head with my life experiences, it just seems natural to want to share it and maybe embellish it a bit.
Wow, that's great. You're right. Life teaches us a lot. I'm just glad that you're putting it all down and sharing.
I wish it was all put down. I'm working on it.
Good. Thank you so much. Thank you. Mike, would you like to go next? Where do you get your ideas?
Sure. Well, I did not invent the storyline for American Atrocity. It was handed to me. I lived it. And like some of the other folks, I took a real life situation, embellished a little bit on it to make it a little more interesting, worked on the dialogue to make it a little clearer and more articulate. But basically, it's a true life story. Some of the chapters are exactly the way things happen, so I can't take credit for inventing the storyline.
Okay, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Now we are going to move to our next question. So our next question is for E.A. Dustin. Is what was one of the most surprising things you learned in creating your books? And what are the challenges of being an indie writer?
Okay, I might have misunderstood the question, but if you're asking me what was one of the most surprising things that I learned doing the research for the book, then I would say this. There are a lot of surprising facts about World War II, but one of them I thought was most surprising or interesting is, did you know that by the end of World War II, almost 150,000 church bells dating from the 12th to the 20th century from church towers all over the European continent had been melted down to support the Nazi war effort. To me, that was like very shocking to think that they would take 150,000 church bells from all over Europe just to fight the war. And I think a deacon said it best when he said it goes against any feelings that they who like no other preach peace and should heal wounded hearts, should tear apart bodies in gruesome murders. So I thought that was, to me, that was most shocking, that they would do something like that. I mean, not most shocking, but it was a surprise in my research. And then the biggest challenge in being an indie author is to get the word out. To when I wrote my technical books, Addison Wesley and Prentice Hall, they did everything. You had an editor, you had a publisher. They translated into numerous languages. It was translated in Chinese, Korean. As an indie author, you're doing it all yourself. So as an indie author, you are your own editor. You're your own. You find your publisher. You in the marketing, you have to do all the marketing yourself. Like I said, the publishers generally do all the marketing and get the word out. So to me, that's the biggest challenge.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Sure.
Again, tell us one of the most surprising things you learned in creating your books, and tell us about the challenges of being an indie writer.
Well, the thing that surprised me the most was the realization that writing fiction was completely different from writing nonfiction. In nonfiction, you want to fence in the reader, you want to absolutely dominate the scene, you flood the reader with detail.
Okay.
Writing things, you don't want to leave any room for confusion. But when you write fiction, I realize that you got to bring the reader or the passenger into the cockpit with you. In other words, you want the reader to carry some of the load, to imagine things. If you watch storytellers talk to kids, young people, a story, they don't flood that little kid with all kinds of detail. They pick a few things and wait to ignite the imagination of that reader. So you have to hold yourself back when you write fiction. You have to pick a few things and use them as a match to ignite the imagination of that reader. And so it's very different from being particularly a legal writer, where you just want to absolutely dominate and control the reader and make your reader kind of a storage bin where you just throw in all this detail and totally dominate the scene. So that was a surprise to me, and I worked very hard to try to accomplish that, to try to make my reader a co-pilot with me. And the challenge, of course, was I had to learn this the hard way. This is my first work of fiction, and I do feel that I learned it. And I had some support from some editors who looked at what I had done. So it was a real challenge, but that was the real surprise to me, was how very different fiction is. And particularly with romance, I was, one thing I remember, I went back, I'd never read Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. So I did, I went back, and I was really disappointed because when Anna meets Vronsky, there's just a few scenes where they see each other at the state railroad station. He then sees her at the ball. He asks her to dance. They sort of interact a little bit, and the next thing you know, the next paragraph, they're having an affair. And I'm thinking, it's all on one page. I mean, there's no really. Tolstoy, as great as he is, doesn't like the match of my imagination. He doesn't really give me some of those details so I can see the magic of this romance blossom. So I tried to do that, but that was the real surprise for me, was how fiction works as opposed to nonfiction.
Wow, thank you. That's great. Thank you, Steve. Paul, would you like to go next, please? One of the most surprising thing you learn in creating your books and the challenges of being an indie writer.
Okay, well, in the case of Killin Blues, the most surprising thing I found, in the course of the book, there are 10 of the early blues greats that are murdered. And what I did, they all die where they actually died, Chicago, Mississippi, wherever they actually lived and died. But what was surprising was out of those 10 people, 3 of them were in their 40s, the rest were in their 20s and 30s. I mean, that is how tough life was in the Great Depression. These people, it was just, it ground people down. A couple of them drank themselves to death. Leroy Carr, who was a pianist and blues singer in Indianapolis. Charlie Patton, he was a hard living character. He died, I think, at 43. That was a surprise. What wasn't a surprise was the fact that so much of what happened in that horrific era is happening now again. The same economic challenges, the same prejudice, the same atrocities that we're seeing today. One of the things that strikes me as someone who's had books published by large trade publishers like HarperCollins and done some self-publishing is you're on your own in both situations. My editors at HarperCollins didn't back me up on anything, and my book Secret Heroes has a huge glaring mistake in it that I'm so embarrassed by. I bought a rubber stamp to correct that copy that
Oh
I
my.
stamped that it had to do with the Civil War, and it was a real boner. Of course, as an indie writer, you don't get any backup at all. In terms of marketing, you are on your own to market your books as an independent writer. When you're working with one of the publishing houses, they support you for 30 days, and then it's on to the next project. I called my publicist at HarperCollins one day, and she told me, "I'm sorry, your time has passed. We can't spend any more time on your book." So it's a tough world, whether you're published by another thing he told me, I think E.A. Dustin mentioned earlier about book signings. HarperCollins didn't care about book signings. They say it doesn't do us any good for you to sell 15 books at a bookshop. They want online coverage. They want a lot of news coverage. They want hundreds of thousands of eyeballs, not 15, 20, 30. So
Wow. That's challenging. That's challenging. Well, thank you for sharing that, Paul. Tony, would you like to go next, please? Talk about your surprising things you learned creating your books and the challenges.
Okay. Well, I'll mention one thing that didn't surprise me, but may surprise some of the people who are attending. And that is, I enjoy the process of writing. I enjoyed working with editors and the designers. Every step of the process was really good. The most surprising part was just how amazingly great it feels to hold your book in your hand for the first time when it's a physical object. That's a really wonderful feeling. And I didn't expect that. I thought, well, I've had things printed before. I've had cartons of material arrive at my house. But there's something about seeing a book, especially when you come from a background like mine, where there was just such reverence for books. I mean, you don't mark in a book. You don't throw a book away. You find someone else to give it to. Every book is treated a bit like the Bible or the Quran. And to have your ideas, your name, that was a thrill.
Wow, that's great. And what are the challenges of being an indie writer?
Yeah, there's no money. Well, there is. I spent quite a bit. Yeah, and I'm quite surprised that over and again, even writers who seem well known and successful, it's not easy to maintain yourself in any kind of American middle class lifestyle on your writing.
Right. Wow. Wow. Well, thank you so much, Tony. Thank you so much. Mike, would you like to go next? Tell us
Yeah.
surprising things you learn in creating your books and the challenges of being an indie writer.
Well, spending years as an attorney writing briefs and motions, you're always constrained by the facts. If there are unfavorable facts, you have to deal with those unfavorable facts. And sometimes that can be quite a challenge. It's rare that the facts are always on your side and there are no facts on the other side. And when I was writing fiction, I discovered that if you don't like the facts, you just change them. And that was a wonderful feeling. It was exhilarating to not be constrained by unfavorable facts. And that was a surprise to me, I guess. The challenge of being an indie writer is not writing. I enjoyed writing. I think the biggest challenge is marketing your book and getting it out to people who are prospective purchasers, figuring out ways to do that are reasonably making a reasonable effort to get it out there. So I guess that's my answer to the challenges.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you. We are going to.
Could I add in my comments? Could I make another comment?
Sure. Of course.
Sure, all of us here have had the trying experience of landing an agent, or maybe you haven't. Maybe you just did it all yourself. I have had relationship with two agents. One was a small local agent, which she didn't really do anything for me. The other one, I had an agent at William Morris, which is one of the largest agencies in the country. And my takeaway from that is an agent loves you until they don't. That agent at William Morris sold my book to HarperCollins, which was a great accomplishment. But the biggest disappointment I had was she was negotiating a TV deal, the TV development project based on my book. And in the middle of it, she simply dropped it and stopped returning my calls. And that was my end of my relationship with William Morris. So it is a cutthroat business. As I said, they love you until they don't.
Wow, great. Thank you, Paul, for sharing that. Thank you so much. Thank you. So now what time is it? It's 1:13. We're doing good with the time. So the next question is, how can people buy your books? And E.A. Dustin, would you like to go first?
Okay. You skipped the question about does writing energize or exhaust you?
Right. I'm going to look at the time, and if time allows, then I was gonna go back to that question.
Okay,
but
perfect.
The last question is very important, and I do not want to skip that, so I was gonna.
Sure.
This question
actually,
first.
you know what? So my book is actually available on any website, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, anywhere that you can get books. And I know that Fairfax County actually has Saved Me Twice also. They have a couple of copies. And so just Google Save Me Twice and get it from your preferred book reseller. And I also just put the message for a link to it in the chat.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. Thank you so much. Stephen, how can people buy your books?
Yeah, well, here it is. The girl to his left, all right, which really talks about when he first meets her, she's on his left and on a bench, and then her political views are kind of left to his. So that's why the title is. But anyway, you can get this book on Amazon. Kindle Direct Publishing is the platform I use. So you go on Amazon, Kindle Direct, and it's free if you're a member of the the Kindle Direct Publishing Unlimited, which I think is $10 a month, and then you can download a host of books. Otherwise, it's just $2.99 for an ebook and $9.99 as a paperback. So it's very easy. It's exclusively offered through Amazon. And the advantage I had to that was access to their Kindle Direct Publishing Unlimited, which opens up the door to more readers. But I just want to make one comment about agents. I had heard so many, Paul, I really appreciate hearing you about that, because it fits. I had heard so many horror stories about it. And I simply decided to totally avoid that. First of all, because I had been on this project a long time, I decided I was going to go ahead and get it over with. If you secure an agent, that agent's still going to take all kinds of time to try to sell your book. And then if they do, it's going to take time for the publisher to say, well, we're going to put it in 2022 or something. So I totally avoided. I'm not a fan of agents based on what I've heard. And I think just direct publishing yourself is a very good avenue to pursue. So that's what I did.
Okay, thank you so much, Steve. Paul, would you like to go next, please? Tell us, how can we buy your books?
Well, title again is Killin, Floor Blues, and it's available on all outlets, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Apple Books. Anyone who wants to go and make it to my website, paulmartinbooks.com. There's a buy now button that will take you to my authors page on Amazon where all my books are listed. So, and you can get it through the publisher, Level Best Books.
Okay.
So it's available widely.
Wow, great. Thank you so much. Tony, would you like to tell us how can we buy your books?
Yes, as the saying goes, wherever books are sold, it's available on Amazon, as you can see. Other way, I don't have the weatherman trick down quite yet. And if you follow that URL at the bottom, that's one of those URL shortening services. So no www, just type in tiny.cc2cunning. And that'll take you to my website where you can see some sample chapters from both books.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Tony. And Mike, would you like to tell us, please? How can
Sure.
we buy your books?
I'm going to hold up American Atrocity. It's available on Amazon in paperback for $13.99, and it's also available for free, the Kindle version on Amazon. Search Mike McCary, it'll get you there the most direct way on the Amazon website.
Great, great. Thank you. Thank you so much, all of you. And looks like we do have about 10 to 12 minutes. So I would like to cover rest of the question. 2 questions that I have left out. I just wanted to skip to this question first because it's very important. So we do have time. So now I would like to ask our other 2 questions. If you can please go quickly with these. So my next question is, does writing energize or exhaust you? And E.A. Dustin, would you like to go, please?
Sure. So, right, I also saw a bunch of questions from the audience. I don't know if you'll get to those, but
that's why I'm looking. We will have time. We will. That's
okay. Perfect.
Yeah, we'll have
perfect.
time.
Writing most days energizes me, and time flies for me when I write more than any activity. So it's very energizing for me, and it's never done. You're never done writing a book. You're always thinking about the plot. You're always thinking about how you can improve it. Even if you go for walks with family or friends, you often think about the plot or how you can improve it. Even when I read another book or watch a movie, you think about writing your book, and it's really all consuming, and it can be, but it's definitely energizing. But there's definitely days when it's exhausting, especially when you're editing, and you're just never happy with the result, and you want to improve it. So that's what I would say about writing, and energizing or exhausting you. And to the author who mentioned that HarperCollins said, it wasn't worth it to do book signings because you only sell like 10 or 15 at the bookstore. And that's really true. You know, you go to book signings at Barnes and Nobles, and then you really will only sell 10 or 15. But the experiences, you know, telling your story to people and listening to their stories, it's really worth it. Because I've met so many interesting people doing book signings where people actually share their stories. And it's amazing how many different interesting stories everyone has. Everybody has a story to tell, and it's interesting to hear. So I guess the answer is writing energizes me.
Okay, great, great. Well said. Thank you so much. Thank you. Steve, would you like to tell us whether it energizes you or exhausts you?
Well, it energizes me, and really, it's really fun when you throw yourself into this, particularly writing a romantic relationship. Does the guy get the girl? He's pursuing her. What does he say? What does she say to him? You imagine all these scenes, the little nuances of courtship and saying dumb things, and it just it's just fun. I mean, and I found that to be the most enjoyable part. Writing other stuff at times. Combat was, I wrote a little bit about combat. Did not experience, obviously, combat myself. So I had to, that drained me at times. And I relied a lot on memoirs, and I used my imagination. But that part was more challenging, and choosing just the right words, not overloading the detail. You know, you've got to move. You can't dwell too much. As I said, you got to just pick a few key facts that triggers the imagination of the reader, because you want the reader to carry some of the load. They're going to be a co-pilot, as I said. So that drains you. And I have a question here to my fellow authors. You know, there would be times when I would work on a paragraph over and over, and I would try to pick the right verb or just the right word or something. And I thought I had it, and then, I can't explain why this happened, but it happened to me many times. I'd go to bed at night, sleep, and then, wake up semi-awake at maybe 4 or 5 in the morning. You know how it is. You have that period where you're sort of awake, but you're still sleepy. And all of a sudden, the right word just dropped into my brain. My brain somehow recalled this struggle I had hours earlier, and just the right word just dropped right there. I mean, I can't explain it. It was like my brain just needed to get away from it and then sleep. And then all of a sudden, boom, it just came. So anyway, that was my experience. That was
I'm
fun.
with you. I'm with you on that, Steve. I bet every one of us has a pencil and paper near the bed for exactly that reason. You don't want to miss those things.
I made a discovery. I found a ballpoint pen that the tip of it lights up. Light on every time and wake my wife up to write something down. So now I can get my little pen out and write my notes in the middle of the night.
Great. That's great. Thank you, Stephen. And Paul, would you like to continue? Next.
I mean, it's writing is of course energizing, and it's I use a sports analogy. Sportsmen talk about getting in the zone, and that's what I think writers look for. And like Steve said, I've spent an entire morning on a paragraph, but if I get in the zone, I can write a chapter. And often the greatest surprise as a writer is when you look at something and just marvel at how in the world you put it all together, because you can talk a good idea away. If you sit down with a table over a beer with somebody and you start talking about your ideas, for some reason they don't sound as good when they come out of your mouth. But if you sit down and start writing them, you'll surprise yourself by how cohesive they are and coherent. And so I think that getting in the zone is the thing that I look for. And it's for me at my age, instead of being exhausting, it's debilitating because I get so caught up in writing. I will sit at my computer for 5 hours and sometimes I can barely get out of the chair. So I got myself a little timer that I set it and it rings once an hour and I get up and walk around because otherwise I'll just sit there until I freeze up.
Wow. Yeah. Well, thank you. Thanks for sharing that. Tony, would you like to go next?
No need. Paul and Steve have covered it.
All right. Great, great, great. Save us some time. Good. Thank you so much. Thank you, Tony. And would you like to say, go next, Mike?
Sure. Well,
Energize or exhaust you?
I think, like most authors, we find writing to be exhilarating and uplifting. I'll share one story about picking the right word because I think that is extremely important. I don't know whether this is true or not, but supposedly when FDR was preparing a speech to address Congress after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the initial draft that he got said December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in history. And FDR scratched out the word history and put in infamy. December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy. And now I think most people recognize that phrase because he changed that one word, whereas had he left the original draft, a day that would live in history, probably no one would remember that line.
Wow. Great. Great. Thank you so much. So now I would like to move to, I see some questions on the chat. So I would like to move to question and answer sessions. And thank you for everything. Let's see. Again, do you see a problem with readers thinking everything in historical fiction actually happened and is true? Any of you like to answer that?
Could you give the question again?
Do you see a problem with readers thinking everything in historical fiction actually happened and is true?
Well, I will say in my historical fiction, I usually have author's notes at the end, and I try to distinguish between what actually happened and what I made up, just so there's no confusion.
Okay, anybody else would like to answer that, or should I move to the next one?
I think what a big factor there is writing, how far back is your fiction? I mean, I belong to a couple historic fiction groups, and they're all women, and they're all writing stories about Jane Austen type characters or Henry VIII and his wives, and I'm the only guy there, and I'm writing about historic fiction, but it's just 50 years old. So if you're writing about things that are still within the memory of people in our age, they have a feel, and your audience very often is our age. They have a feel for a lot of what happened, and they remember a lot of these events. So I don't think, in my case, I made references at the end and acknowledged the sources I relied on, but a lot of the things I talked about are well-known events. The protests over Dow Chemical, they were the manufacturers of napalm, and those events at the University of Wisconsin, the moratorium in New York City, some of the protest matters, some combat scenes, individual combat scenes. Obviously, people are going to realize that these are not necessarily historic events. But I think the question is, if you're writing not so far back in time, something that I think is more interesting to people than writing about events 300 and 400 years ago, but that's just my choice. I think people understand those events much better, and then they know which events are real and which aren't.
Yeah, so Corinne, I understand your question simply because my book is based on true events. And, you know, I have received over 200 reviews, and the average is like 4.7 out of 5. But the 1 stars I get is from people that say, now I read this book and I don't know which one is truth and which is fiction. So, you know, I guess the only answer I would have here is, if you're expecting to be educated on history, you know, people should buy history books, but don't expect fiction, you know, to be, you know, your history guide. That's sort of what I would say. Because I mean, some of the feedback literally, some of the reviews literally were, don't read this book for World War II, you know, facts, because you don't know what's truth and what's fiction. So, but maybe I need to take the advice of this other author who says he puts in the back which parts, you know, which parts are facts and which are fiction. Maybe that's something I could do to make those kind of people happy that really want to know which one is, you know, is embellished, which portion of the story is embellished.
Great. Thank you, Ia.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The issue I run into is my novel is written in the first person, and that person has some experiences that are very similar to my actual life. So people wonder, you know, whether that character is me. And I say somewhere early in the preface that the character is not me because I'm much nicer and more intelligent than the protagonist. But when I read historical fiction, I'm very concerned about reality and learning history. But the standard I've come to is I don't need the novel to be true to history. I just need it to be true to life. I want to understand people, not memorize the facts and events. So that's, to me, the role of historical fiction, how I can enjoy it.
I would say that one of the things I enjoy about historical fiction is how a writer can create a fictional situation surrounded by real events. And to me, the mark of how well I like the book is how successfully they played off real history and their story.
Wow. Yeah, that's well said. Great. Thank you so much. Thank you. So I will now move to the next question. This question is from Rosalia Williams. Given the challenges of self-publishing, would the authors do it all over again with a new book? And I see that Tony has replied to that and said, I have self-published 2 books. I would like to do more. I have started writing others, but the time and expense are dauntingly against any financial return. I hope to, but it is hard to commit in the face of the very small chance of being rewarded. So Tony, would you like to add more, or would somebody else would like to answer this question?
Well, if you want to see more of my books, buy more of my books.
Well, since I've had experience with trade publishing and self-publishing, they both have their pluses and their minuses. And if I can't sell a novel that I believe in, I'll publish it myself.
Oh, great. Okay, I guess should I move to the next question?
Well, let me offer a comment about that. In writing and publishing my books, I see it as a exercise in education, that I'm trying to present an idea to get people think about an idea. So whether I'm making money at that or not is not particularly relevant to me. I get the most reward when one of my readers said, you know, your book really made me think. And that's what I'm trying to achieve.
Oh, that's great. That's awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Okay, so next I see E.A. Dustin has shared a link with everyone on Amazon. Her Save Me Twice based on true World War II events. And Tony has done same thing. So please look at those links. Next is a question by Mr. Scott. In researching your story, what sort of sources do you use? Was it difficult to find what you needed? So any of you would like to answer that? Should I repeat the question?
Well, I'll answer what I did for my history of the blues. I read every book I could find on individual blues artists, and there weren't that many. As I said, I have 10 victims in my book. I think I found biographies of half of those. The others you get in bits and pieces from collective stories about the blues. And so I've always said that the internet is a mixed blessing because you can find so much on there, but it takes a lot of judgment to decide what it's safe to use and what isn't. So I much prefer printed sources.
Right, I like the expression that the internet's the world's biggest library, but all the books are on the floor.
I think a lot of it has to do with what the time period of your historic fiction is. I mean, I've met some people who are writing about, Roman centurions or Viking female warriors during the 11th century or something, and they spend an enormous amount of time trying to just get some little fact right. I respect that, but that just strikes me as just a huge waste. Not necessarily, but I think there's so much available now in things that have occurred in this century, whether it be World War I, World War II, the Depression. There's so many memoirs today. People, and I really found this true with Vietnam veterans. People can, ever since word processing came out, 30 years ago, I meet these guys at the wall that are 70 years old, and they tell me that their daughter or their son-in-law encouraged them to sit down at the computer, and they cranked out these memoirs. They're all over the place now because these men are beginning to realize I got to get my story down. This did not happen after World War II or Korea. It was much more difficult to write a memoir, but memoirs are immensely helpful in capturing events, and I relied on them very much, as well as just the oral histories that people told me about some of these strange events. So what I rely on.
So for my book, I did, of course, as I mentioned, I had my dad as the source, but I also visited the Dachau concentration camp. I visited the Holocaust Museum. So I did a lot of research. And of course, like everybody else said, the authors here, there's always Google. But you also have to, check your sources, because we also know there's a lot of misinformation on there. But I think in some situations, actually visiting a place like Dachau cannot take, you can't get that same experience and feeling by just looking at Google.
I have found, I have used the New York Times database. The New York Times maintains copies online of their papers going back about 100 years, I think. And I have found those articles to be helpful to me in doing research. One of the dangers is that when you look at these old papers and you find an interesting article, you're kind of attracted to looking at other articles, and you get waylaid. But the New York Times database has been very helpful to me.
Mike, thanks for mentioning that. I agree with you. One of the nice things about that database is it shows images of the page, which gives you a context and just a feeling for it that's more of the time. But like you said, it could be just more rabbit holes to chase down too.
It's funny because that happened to me too, because I had to write about some protest events here in the United States. They were covered by I didn't have memoirs to rely on. I really relied on newspaper stories as well as my own imagination and some histories that were written. But it's true. You get waylaid. You know, you start looking at advertisements of in New York Times in the 1960s about automobiles or washing machines, or I mean, it's kind of, you do get waylaid. It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's a hazard. It's a hazard.
But it also reminds you of the gender roles and assumptions
Yeah,
from that
that's
era.
right.
One of the things one of the sources I've used is the Library of Congress. They have a collection of newspapers from all over the country, from the earliest part of this 20th century, and you do get caught up just in the history, but you also see the biases of the time. And I have never taken anything from any newspaper without substantiating it from other sources, because you really see, as I was writing my collections of biographies, I had a rule of thumb. I had to have at least 3 sources for every fact. And often it comes down to kind of a weighing game. You just have to balance it out. And if there's no clear-cut fact, you have to state it in a way that makes it obvious, that it's not hard and fast.
Wow, that's great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your comments and ideas and suggestions. We have 2 more questions, and we have about 15 minutes. So I would like to go through these 2 questions quickly. The next question is from Renee Edwards. You are writers, she says, not graphic artists. What would you say to an author who wanted to design their own cover? Who would like to go?
I designed my covers on my self-published books.
Mhm.
So I don't know where the other people got them, but I designed them myself.
Yeah, I have one of each. One I did myself and one that I hired an artist for. I did not do the one that's on the screen. I did my other one.
Hey,
I hired an artist who did everything I asked her to do, but after looking at her finished product several weeks later, I concluded, no, this is not right. So I used stock photos, and there's an amazing stuff, a lot of possibilities for you. And then I used some photos of a typical Vietnam helicopter. And then I had the assistance of a person who put this together. We merged the helicopter on the photo, and it worked, I think, fairly well. So I think stock photos are very helpful. And but if you got an artist, that's a good idea too. Just in my case, it through my fault, not the art. The artist did everything I asked her to do, but my vision, as communicated the artist, in the end, I changed my vision on her, and I said, no, it's not going to work. So there's all kinds of possibilities.
My cover is a collection of 2 photos that I took, and I don't know if this option is available to other people, but I used to be on the board at Flint Hill School, and what I did was I said I will put up a prize of $500 if students want to offer a combination of these 2 pictures in designing a cover. And what I got back was a very creative cover from a very talented 16-year-old, and I used it, and it's been a great cover for me.
great. Thank you, Mike.
Yeah. One challenge these days, well, the last 10 years or so with book covers is people aren't going to look at it life size like this. They're going to see it maybe an inch high on Amazon. So the cover has to be clear when it's tiny.
Also, I think the cover really is critical. I mean, I hate to admit that, but people do judge the book by the cover, and you put all this effort and time into the content of your work, and then the cover is critically important in terms of conveying the kind of setting and mood, the story that sort of underlies that visual imagery that this person who doesn't know a thing about your book is going to see. So the cover is really important, and it's worth spending the money, my opinion, to invest in helping the cover.
Great, great. Thank you so much. We have about one more question and 13 minutes. So I would, and then so I would like to ask this last question. It's by Rosalia Williams. And her question is, having your books in a public library does not pay, but it gives name recognition and perhaps credibility. How difficult is it for you to get your book in a library?
I think you should answer that question.
I can tell you what
You work at the library.
right, but I can tell you what I did to get mine into the library. There's actually a form you can fill out to have your book, included in the library. But then it goes through a process. It actually gets read and assessed, because they won't put just any book into the library. So
That's
it took
correct.
actually, I think it took like 3 months. Someone reviewing, I don't know how many people reviewed it. And then they approved it. And now it's in the library.
We have a committee that does that process, and I myself don't know how many people, but that's correct. There is a form on our library website that you can fill out, and you can request to get your book added to our collection. So I think the first step is, I am not an author. I haven't written anything, so I don't know how it goes. So, but fill out that form if you would like to. And that's correct. It would definitely give you name recognition, perhaps, and credibility, definitely. So yeah, go on our website and fill out a form. We can add your books to our collection. Now, I would like to go ahead and wrap it up. So thank you everyone for being here. And thank you, authors, for being a part of our panel and sharing your experiences as writers. We hope to see everyone tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. for Let's Talk About History. You will meet our panel of local authors as they discuss their books and journey as writers. They are going to talk about history books. Hope to see you all tomorrow. Thank you for participating today. Thank you all for being here. And special thanks to all the writers. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
having
Thank
us.
you.
Yes,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye, everyone.